In this episode, we meet Vic Crockford, co-lead of the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness and former Chief Executive of Community Housing Aotearoa. Vic has known since she was young how much a home matters for children to flourish. Decades later, that understanding has become the engine of her advocacy. In this episode, Vic talks about what the research revealed, that women make up just over half of all people experiencing severe housing deprivation in this country, a figure most New Zealanders would find surprising. She talks about what makes women's homelessness distinct, why the wave building among older women is one the system is nowhere near ready for, and what a genuine women's homelessness strategy would actually look like. More information on this episode can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Char Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.
Vic, thank you for being with us today. I am delighted and privileged to have this conversation with you after working with you for a number of years. Can we start by you telling us a bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you to this work?
Yeah, of course. So thanks, Amanda. I am in the privileged position of being the co-lead of the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness with Dr. Kathy Irwin, who you've also spoken with, and also previous CEO of Community Housing Aotearoa. So that is a really specific way in which I came to this work in recent years is through that role. But actually, the why of why I'm involved in this work stretches back further. And stretches into my father's childhood and the experiences of his mum, my paternal grandmother, Patricia Crockford, who was a single mum with two sons who had to leave a violent relationship, seek secure housing, seek employment, make sure their needs were met, all the while doing a lot of heavy lifting and caregiving for her many nieces and nephews and her siblings and her mum. So really carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders and doing so with such dignity and care and generosity. So she was a huge inspiration to me. But I think one of the things that I learned really early on listening to the stories of family and trying to work out how my dad had frankly managed to break intergenerational cycles of violence, I came to understand how important housing was in that equation. So when my nana came back to New Zealand from Australia to Hastings with her sons, she was able to get state housing. And that was an option that meant that my dad and his brother had stability, and that she could provide a home even whilst, having very few options by way of earning income for some time. So I understood that to be a turning point. Nothing was perfect. I won't go into the details of that, but it certainly was a really important factor in the way that my dad's life turned out, and therefore mine. And my life has been a life of housing security and, a home full of love and opportunities. So instinctively, I've known for a very long time how important a home is for children to flourish and for families, to be whole. And then when I was thinking about this the other day, 19, I think, I started volunteering at Wellington Women's Refuge when I was at university, and the experiences I had there and the woman I met there, one of whom remains in my life as a funder of the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness, Jan Logie, taught me so much about the system. And as Kathy puts it so perfectly, the structural violence that is visited on many women by the system. And it also really lit the flame for me when I understood just how hard it was for women to access safe, secure, affordable housing after leaving our safe house. So many couldn't find housing that would ensure they could have their children with them. Many couldn't find housing in a place where their children's schools were located. Many had accessibility needs and they couldn't find accessible housing. And some were older women and they couldn't find housing in a location that made them feel safe and secure and was close to things like the doctor and the supermarket. So I saw all those things firsthand during that experience. So 16 years later, when I came to community housing Aotearoa, I carried that with me. So in some ways, at that time, I was a complete novice in terms of the housing sector and the faith, placed in me to learn quickly was a real privilege. But I brought that experience with me, and I brought that deep intergenerational knowledge with me. And I think that's what has ultimately led me to being so committed to seeing an end to women's homelessness.
Yeah. Thank you, Vic, for sharing that very meaningful why. And I know in your role at the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness, one of the first things that you did was you undertook research to understand the barriers and the solutions to women's homelessness. And I know this research told us that approximately 50,000 women experience homelessness in New Zealand, which accounts for over or about half of people experiencing homelessness. Why is it that women's homelessness is so high here compared to other countries?
It's a question that as soon as we were able to verify those statistics, we began asking ourselves and talking about. So when I say we, at the Coalition, we have a steering committee of wahine toa, Jill Hawkey from the Methodist Mission in Christchurch, Helen Robinson, who's the Auckland City Missioner, Joe Cribb, who's the chair of Te Whare Nuku Noa here in Pōneke, and Carolyn Heriweni, who leads Te Whare Tiaki Wahine Refuge in Porirua. And so, we decided very early on that we were going to be an advocacy group. We were going to help shine a light on these issues. One of our commitments is that where the catalyst sets the sparks aflame. So, creating the movement for change. But when we went to develop advocacy and policy positions, we quickly realised there was very little dedicated research that was current out there that we could lean on with certainty to develop those positions. There was a huge amount of, I say anecdotal, I think that always underserves the term, but a huge amount of knowledge and experience from the front line and from the sector about what was happening, but very little by way of research. So we ended up becoming a research organisation, which actually wasn't in our early plan, but which we were guided toward really ably by Joe Cribb, who saw very quickly that it was going to be important to have a piece of research that we could talk to. So we wove together the insights from 36 women and frontline workers who had experiences of homelessness with data from the integrated data infrastructure. So that looks at all of the administrative data and the census data in one place. It sounds like it would be this wonderful resource that everyone can use and we've got evidence for days, but actually it's really expensive and quite technical to use. So we were supported by statisticians in doing that. Just as an aside, another advocacy point, the IDI needs to be easier for community organisations to use. But what that gave us was this really important verification of what we were being told and what we were observing ourselves. And that is that women are actually just over half of those experiencing severe housing deprivation in this country, and that it's impacting all regions and all age groups, but absolutely especially younger women who are wahine Māori in their majority. And we were seeing an increasing prevalence for older women. Subsequent to that research, Amanda, just to go back to those numbers, the census from 2023 came out and was verified, and it showed that there's actually more women now, so 57,000 women at just over half of those of the severe housing deprivation population. So there we've seen an increase between 2018, which was the majority of the statistics we were relying on for our research, in 2023. So as to your core question of why is this the case? So with all of that context, I think we can come up with two key things. And the first is colonisation. So it is no accident that wahine Māori are so significantly overrepresented. Our research showed at least 1/3, and in other research, including research done to evaluate Housing First, it's showing 2/3, and that is because it's been designed that way. And the opportunities of, the equal opportunities of education and income and all of those things have not been provided to wahine Māori. So I would say the vehicle of colonisation has a huge factor. And the other thing I would say is that women's homelessness is less likely to be seen by the naked eye, because women will do everything that they can to keep themselves, and if they have children, their children safe, which usually means avoiding rough sleeping, sleeping on the street as much as possible. And so we see homelessness through the prism of a single man's experience of homelessness, which is more likely to result in rough sleeping, whereas women are more likely to be on couches, in garages, potentially swapping sex for a roof, undertaking anything they can to keep themselves off the street. And so because we don't see it, we have let it get away on us in terms of having zero specific policy approaches, zero ring-fenced funding, and very little evidence and research to help us understand what's happening. So because of that, it's been hidden in plain sight for so many years and has been allowed to grow in terms of the need and the numbers.
Thank you, Vic. And because it's often not as visible through couch surfing or overcrowding, living in cars, how does this then affect policy, service delivery, and the public's understanding of the issue?
Yeah, so I have this really interesting challenge, because we've spent 2 years now saying women's homelessness is more invisible, as I've just said, but actually it is there, it's not being seen. And the challenge I have is what we see in the research now is women who are experiencing severe housing deprivation across the spectrum. So, whether that is being in temporary accommodation, on someone's couch, in uninhabitable housing, in emergency accommodation, on the streets, they are having multiple, sometimes hundreds of touch points with the state, with the system, whether that be with respect to benefit receipt, whether that be with respect to hospitalisations, whether that be with respect to community mental health engagement, whether that be with respect to victimisation in relation to the justice system, because our research absolutely showed that women are more likely to be the victims of crime than the perpetrators of it. So that they are there and they are being engaged, they are engaging with services and the state over and over and over, but they're not being seen. They're not being seen. And so whilst I've spent 2 years saying women's homelessness is more invisible, I think actually what is happening is they are not being seen. So that is the culpability of not them, but providers and the government, to see them in a different way and distinct from men and their experiences. So I think that's just a really important point to make, because it's certainly a shift in the way that we've thought about how we describe what's happening, because it's actually unfair. It's unfair to say that they're invisible because they're not engaging. But because we have no frameworks to understand their specific needs as women, we've got no policies to understand their specific needs as women. We therefore have no funding, because that flows out of the policy, to understand their needs as women. And therefore we have very little service design or even physical housing that understands their needs as women. So it is a failure on the part of the machinery of government in that regard.
Absolutely. And that totally lines up as well with a conversation that we've had recently with Professor Neville Pearce as well from the University of Otago, who spoke about research that tells us of people experiencing homelessness, individuals interacting with the system and just not being seen. So, Vic, just going back to the data and what you said around the needs of women, What does it reveal about the complex and intersecting needs of women experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, intersectionality is a very important point because it comes up at every stage of our research, and certainly research that we heard about yesterday at a research symposium that we co-hosted with the University of Otago. So I think that there are three key points I'd like to make. And the first is that women's needs are different from men's in the context of experiences of homelessness. Now, that might seem like an obvious point, but as I said, we have no recognition of that as yet in our approach to policy and in our approach to funding. But it is very, very clear from the research that it's the case. And this shows up really specifically in something that will occur probably as obvious once I say it, but that's in relation to pregnancy and childcare. So we heard yesterday from Housing First just how many women that they worked with in their research, the University of Otago with their Housing First research, were hospitalised during pregnancy. So the rate of hospitalisations for maternity needs was so much higher than the general population. I'm not going to quote the number because I won't be accurate, but it was so astonishing that I sat there gobsmacked, even though I've been up close and personal to lots of this research for the last 3 years. So that's one, example of a really gendered need that is very different for women. Once that stat was out in the world, Dr. Philippa Howden-Chapman, who was there, pointed out that she'd seen a woman sleeping rough in labour recently on the street. We heard through our research about women saying they found it really hard to access midwifery support, even in transitional and emergency housing in our research. And we also heard about how hard it was to access sanitary products when they were menstruating, particularly if they were rough sleeping, but also in temporary and emergency accommodation, and how that added a layer of shame to their experiences of homelessness that is very specific to women. So I think that's one kind of clear example where that we need to understand that women's needs are different from men's and design for that. One of the other intersections that I think has been revealed over the course of the last 3 years in the research that's emerging is that women's safety needs are different, and that is true for rough sleeping, but it's also true for other types of housing deprivation. And we heard yesterday from the Wellington City Council how the women that they interviewed for their lived experience research were offering really practical solutions like secure storage lockers and different kinds of lighting, and ensuring that there's CCTV in the places where they feel most safe interacting and sleeping, so that they know that they've got a watchful, eye there for if anything happens. They described the police station in central Wellington and the library being places that they feel most safe because there are people there and they know there are cameras. So again, there's a different type of safety need that's really specific to women that once we start scratching the surface of their stories and really listening to them, we hear really positive, practical solutions that can help for the solve for the practical needs right now while we're working towards, the bigger systems change that's required. And the third intersectionality, I think, is absolutely wahine Māori and their needs as wahine Māori as distinct from their needs as women. And I say distinct in the sense that there are, we heard yesterday, there is proof that kaupapa Māori services and approaches work for them. That was coming through in lived experience research. It was actually coming through as well relative to the Housing First longitudinal research that the University of Otago had done. So everywhere we turn, there are proof points that it really matters, that cultural connection really matters. But it's an intersection that's not really recognised at all in our policies or our funding. It is left up to individual organisations and providers to ensure that they are meeting that need off of their own bat, often fundraising themselves for the shortfall in funding required to provide programs. And so therefore, it's an uneven response because there's no kind of system level recognition that it works and that it's important. In fact, unfortunately, whilst we absolutely applaud the framework of the flexible fund to enable more more flexible opportunities and partnerships, and including in iwi and Māori housing, it came at the expense of ring-fenced Māori housing funding, whai kainga whai oranga. That money was put into the flexible fund, and so now there's not even ring-fence funding for Māori housing, so let alone ring-fence funding that caters to the needs specifically for, women's only and kaupapa Māori approaches. So I think we're getting things kind of right in one place, but at the expense of getting things right in other places. And it's this constant kind of tension in the policy and funding settings, and women are the least served, and then Māori women are the least served. And so their needs are constantly being left out of the mix. Yeah.
Robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Yes, yeah.
And just going to circle back to something you said, Vic, around women's safety.
Yeah.
So what does a lack of gender-specific services actually mean for women's safety and long-term stability? And are there any examples of currently what's working well and could be potentially scaled?
So it's a really good question. So much of what we think about when we think about home and a positive experience of home relates to psychological safety. So it's a term that you're going to call psychological safety. But if you think about what home means to you, I know when I think about my home, I think about my parents and my sister, my grandparents, who I was fortunate to live down the road from. Think about our dog. Think about my comfy bed. I think about home cooking. I think about playing in the summer in my para rubber pool in the Hawke's Bay heat. All those memories that conjure up a sense of belonging and safety. That is at its essence what home is, and what we're all striving for is for people to have that experience when they go home. And I think that therefore that is what psychological safety is at its core. And in order to feel at home, in order to be in a physical structure and feel at home, we need to feel safe in order for that to be home. Otherwise, it's literally a roof. And in some cases, it's actually a traumatic experience, not a positive experience. And so when women who are already traumatized, very often at the hands of men, and unfortunately, through sexual violence or domestic violence, or at the hands, unfortunately, again, of the state, because we know there was significant surfacing of women's experience of abuse in state care in the Royal Commission report. So when they go into a mixed gender space, no matter how well that service is designed, that housing service, that food service, that healthcare service, for many women experiencing severe housing deprivation, that is an unsafe space for them psychologically, just immediately, because there are a lot of men there. And so particularly in a housing setting, when you are in a mixed gender housing setting that might be emergency accommodation, or it might be apartments, or, there are a broad range of people there who you don't know, many of whom are men, it can be a deeply unsettling and unsafe experience for women. And they told us so in their own words in our research. So therefore, if we want women to feel safe and take that first step towards housing security by feeling like they have a place that they can call home and feel safe and secure, and then seek potentially employment opportunities or education opportunities, or get a driver's license and do all the things that we know are going to really make a long-term difference to their health and their wealth, they need to be able to stay in that place and know that they're safe and secure. And in so many cases, that means it needs to be women's only, particularly in that initial, more precarious time when they're in a transitional space. And whether that's physical transitional housing or more like in a transition between housing precarity and housing security, safety and psychological safety is paramount. So it's not a fluffy, idea to say, people need psychological safety for investment in housing to succeed. It's an evidence-based thing that women have told us in their own words. So women's only services, just there needs to be more of them at their core. But to your question around what's working are those services that have been designed from a woman's needs backwards. So I can give you two really great examples. So Te Whare Hina Tore, which was born out of a recognition at the Auckland City Mission that they were not seeing as many women as they knew required support in their services. And when they went out and talked to them, discovered that it's because the woman felt unsafe. They went about developing a trauma-informed transitional housing offer for women only. And it's been a very successful approach. And there's been an evaluation done that talks about the fact that the safety aspect, has been paramount to the success of that approach. So just on that basis, I would say, here's one example within the current contracting model we have, transitional housing model, where a trauma-informed women's only approach is proving really successful for setting women up well. Another example is Te Whare Nukunoa here in Pōneke, which takes a kaupapa Māori approach and is very, very much about wraparound. So it says, we will get you in here and we will put our arms around you and we will support you with your individual needs, potentially longer than what we're funded to do. Because we know having you here is the moment in time that we've got to reconnect you with the things that are going to set you up for success when you move into more permanent housing. And in order to do that, they often have to fundraise because that's not catered for in the current funding settings. What we care about in the current funding settings, actually, the message is bed nights. It's not about that holistic support that's going to work for women. And then I would say we can look to two examples in the women's refuge, in the women's refuge space, Te Whare Tiaki Wahine Refuge in Porirua, and also the work going on up in Hauraki that Denise Messiter and her team are leading in that space, because what they're thinking about is not just what happens for the woman when they're in their whare in the kind of emergency sense, but what happens for them when they leave, what kind of supports they need, what kind of connection they need, what kind of potential upskilling or education opportunities they need. So we've got great examples of things that are working, but we've got absolutely, it's a fight to get the money to fit the model. I think Helen Robinson, won't mind me quoting her, she described it as like trying to backbend into a small box and do some sort of circus contortion in order to get the transitional housing funding. Yeah.
So acknowledging that point then, Vic, that housing policies are largely designed for and around single men, how should policy and housing solutions be informed to meet the diverse needs of women?
Yeah, so it really starts at that policy setting level. And I say that because, as I said, policies cascade to funds, which cascade to how services are designed and delivered, which cascade to how houses are designed and built. And what we've got now is a completely gender blind approach. At the moment, we've had really positive response and traction from HUD and MSD in terms of helping find and release gender disaggregated data. But in all honesty, until we started asking 3 years ago, there wasn't any. We went to, again, develop advocacy positions, and we couldn't find any gender disaggregated data to tell us how many women were in transitional housing or emergency accommodation anywhere publicly available. So, we haven't had the basic levels of even high level gender disaggregated data. And then, of course, when you can then layer in the ethnic data what's happening in terms of people's disabilities, what's happening in terms of aging, you can get a really nuanced and evidence-based approach to how you invest to make sure that the most people are looked after. But we didn't even have the basics in place a few years ago, and that is starting to change. But I would say at the highest level, we need policies that are informed by gendered data, gender desegregated data, and we need policies that are designed from a titiriti-based approach. So a titiriti-based, gender desegregated, data-informed approach to policy is what's going to ensure we meet the needs of wahine Māori, who are, if we look at Housing First, up to 2/3 of those of the women in Housing First experiencing homelessness. So I think we've not got the basics right, so we need to start with getting the basics right, but I would hate for that to cause paralysis of action. So let's use what we know to be working and what we know to be true to start informing a different type of policy design, but it absolutely needs to be gendered. And at the moment, we don't have that anywhere in our system, but we do now have a tool that we can use in the Papatūānuku paradigm, that was commissioned by the coalition to help inform what good practice looks like when it comes to that titiriti based and gender desegregated data informed policy development. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you, Vic. What are the coalition's key asks?
We just heard one. please, better data. And look, data, we heard yesterday, and I have Paula Moyle, who came down from Hauraki in my mind. Data is people's stories. So I want to say, I don't say that lightly. And we are always looking for the weaving of the stories and the numbers. But at a macro level, we need gender desegregated data that pays attention to the fact that behind each of those numbers is an individual with a story, and often a story of trauma. So, our ask is, can we have a women's homelessness strategy? And why women? Because of the 57,000 women that make up over half of those experiencing severe housing deprivation. So if we're talking about bang for buck in terms of where we invest our money, it's there. So can we have a women's homelessness strategy that's titiriti based and is informed by really robust gender desegregated data? So that would be ask one. And I know that there's a school of thought that says, hey, we've got strategies coming out the wazoo. But like I said, if we don't have that in place, then we're not triggering a change in response in the policies, and when that aren't triggering a change in response in the funding and the service design and the delivery of houses and housing, future housing developments. So we need that strategy, and we need that to be informed by number 2, ask more cross-agency collaboration on this issue. It's really important because what we know to be true is that women are interacting with MSD a significant amount, because they are the primary, women experiencing homelessness are the primary recipients of the sole parent benefit in our society. We also know that they are interacting with the health system in terms of hospitalisations, in terms of community mental health support. We can see all these things in the IDI in our own research and others' research. So we absolutely need a cross-agency approach to investing in better housing outcomes for women. I think number 3 would be, we need to absolutely pay the most attention to younger women with children and older women. And within those two, absolutely wahine Māori. So we're seeing younger women with children. Lots of the women have 3 or more children in the woman that we spoke with and identified in our research, and the others have as well. Yeah. So if we are not intervening for women, we are putting a huge number of our future generation at risk of housing precarity, and kind of the opposite outcome for what happened to my family. And at the other end of life, we're really failing older women as well. We're seeing, Kathy, I know, has expressed for this interview, the structural reasons why Māori women are coming to the end of their lives and are looking at a really, really difficult retirement outcome. And we have always said housing outcomes for older women are absolutely related to income and pay gaps throughout their lives. So the gender and ethnic pay gap becomes the housing security gap for older women, and we're just starting to see that wave break on our society at the moment. So as our society structurally ages, we're going to have women are living longer. We're probably going to have more single older women, and many of them are in the rental market and unable to afford it, and are starting to turn to transitional housing because that's the only option that they've got once they are potentially forcibly, removed from their home, whether that's through sale or just the inability to make rent. So if we aren't paying attention to that, the crest of that wave is going to break on our society, and we are not going to be prepared for how it's going to impact hospitalizations and the cost of public health. We're not going to be prepared for how it's going to impact on transitional housing and emergency housing. We're not going to be prepared for the human impact and the cost of not having prepared to look after our nanas and our kuia. So we need to be yesterday, 10 years ago, we needed to be preparing and making sure we're closing the income gaps now for the next generation, but also looking after the current generation that is in more and more need. So that's a really big ask. If we're focusing our interventions, we need to be looking at young mums with kids who are predominantly wahine Māori in the context of severe housing deprivation, and we need to be understanding what's happening for our older women, especially our older Māori women, but actually, all women are coming into retirement having earned less money over their lives in our society as well. So those are the really key things. And then I think the last ask is actually getting very serious about how we are designing our services and our houses, and that's probably more an ask of the sector, and the sector has been really responsive to that. So there is a hunger for knowledge out there. We've been working on communities of practice, and for a number of years we've been trying to get our head around how we might enable a design guide. But our kind of call to the sector would be, when you're about to introduce a new program or think about a new housing development, have you thought about women's needs as women, and from there all of the intersecting needs of women as well. Yeah.
Vic, thank you for taking the time to talk to us this afternoon, and thank you to you and Kathy for your leadership, and mahi at the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness. Ngā mihi nui.
Ngā mihi, it was my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Vic for taking the time to speak with us for this episode. More information on this episode can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Cha Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.